It was one of those early flights when most people just wanted to settle in, grab a drink, and drift off to sleep until landing. I found myself in the middle seat of row 13, squeezed between a teenager lost in his phone and an elderly woman knitting. The cabin was buzzing with the usual pre-flight activity: passengers stowing bags, adjusting seatbacks, and preparing for takeoff. Then I noticed him, a tall man in a sharp suit, sitting a few rows ahead of me by the window. His posture was confident, but there was a faint tiredness in his eyes, like he'd been on the road for a while. His dark skin and well-groomed beard made him stand out, and the expensive navy suit he wore only added to the impression that he wasn't your average traveler. He seemed calm enough, but there was an air about him that suggested something more. The first sign of trouble came when the flight attendant, a woman in her 30s named Emily, approached him as he settled into his seat. Her smile was polite, but didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sir, I believe you're in the wrong seat," she said, her voice just a little too sharp. "This is the premium section." The man looked up, slightly confused. "I'm aware," he replied smoothly. "This is my seat." Emily didn't seem convinced. "I'll need to see your boarding pass." He handed it over without hesitation. Emily studied it for a moment. Then her face tightened. "This doesn't seem right," she said, her tone becoming more cold. "Are you sure this is your assigned seat?" I was taken aback. The man, however, remained calm. "Yes, that's my seat. Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice still controlled. Emily stiffened, her expression hardening as she tried to mask her discomfort. "Well, it's just that we don't usually see passengers like—" She paused mid-sentence, the implication lingering in the air. The man's eyes flickered, a brief flash of something, hurt or maybe anger, flashed across his face. "Passengers like what?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. Emily's face flushed, but she quickly composed herself. "Forget it," she snapped. "Just stay in your seat." I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. I glanced around at the other passengers. Most were absorbed in their own activities, but a few had caught the exchange. They looked uncomfortable, though no one spoke up. The man didn't react outwardly, though I could tell the interaction had left a mark. He straightened his tie and gazed out the window, ignoring the curious looks from nearby passengers. As the flight progressed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Emily, meanwhile, seemed to go out of her way to avoid acknowledging the man. She was overly polite to everyone else, but when she passed by him, she barely made eye contact and served him with a stiff smile. The situation escalated midway through the flight. Emily was walking through the aisle when the man pressed the call button. She approached him, already looking tense. "Yes?" she asked curtly. "I'd like a glass of water, please," he requested calmly. Emily sighed heavily, as though his request was a major inconvenience. "Fine," she muttered, turning on her heel. When she returned, she almost slammed the glass onto his tray, spilling some of it in the process. She didn't apologize, just said, "Here." The man, unfazed, looked up at her and said, "Thank you. And could you please ask the head flight attendant to speak with me when you have a moment?" Emily's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Why?" she asked. "I just need to speak with them," he replied evenly. She hesitated but nodded curtly and walked away. A few minutes later, a man named Greg, the lead flight attendant, arrived. He greeted the man warmly with a smile. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I assist you?" Greg asked. The man returned the smile, though his eyes were serious. "Hi, Greg. I just wanted to bring something to your attention. There was a misunderstanding earlier with one of your crew members." Greg looked concerned. "I'm very sorry to hear that. What happened?" Before the man could speak further, Emily arrived, her tone sharp. "What's going on?" she asked, her posture stiff. Greg glanced at her, confused. "I'm just addressing a concern this passenger has." Emily scoffed, clearly dismissive. "He's upset because I asked him to show his ticket earlier. I was just doing my job." The man's calm demeanor didn't falter. "Actually, it's not just about that. It's about how I was treated. I don't think it's right for someone to make assumptions about a passenger based on their appearance." Greg's face softened, but Emily's expression hardened. "I wasn't making assumptions," she snapped. Greg, now looking more serious, cut her off. "Let's take a moment here." The man, undeterred, reached into his bag and pulled out a sleek folder. He handed a document to Greg. As Greg read it, his face went pale. "Sir," Greg stammered, "I had no idea. I sincerely apologize." Emily looked from Greg to the man, her confusion evident. "What's going on?" she demanded. Greg turned to her, his expression now stern. "Emily, this is Mr. Blackwell. He's the CEO of the airline." The cabin fell silent. Passengers close enough to hear exchanged looks of disbelief. Emily froze, her face going from red to pale in a heartbeat. She started, but no words came out. Mr. Blackwell glanced at her, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Emily," he said, "I think you owe me an apology." Emily stammered, I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwell." He didn't let her finish. "And would that make it acceptable for me to be treated like that? Had I not been who I am?" he asked quietly. Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "No, sir. It wouldn't." He studied her for a long moment. "Everyone deserves respect, regardless of how they look, their ticket, or their position. I hope you'll remember that moving forward." Emily nodded quickly, still in shock. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. I'm so sorry." He nodded briefly and turned back to Greg. "Thank you for addressing this quickly. I trust you'll handle it from here." Greg nodded vigorously. "Absolutely, Mr. Blackwell. Once again, we apologize for this situation." Mr. Blackwell gave a slight nod and turned back to the window. His focus returned. Emily hurried away, her head down, and the atmosphere in the cabin slowly returned to normal. As we landed, I watched Mr. Blackwell gather his things and leave the plane. Passengers watched him with a mix of awe and respect. Emily, on the other hand, kept her eyes down, avoiding anyone's gaze as she disappeared into the terminal. It hit me then, true power isn't about wealth or position. It's about how you treat others, especially when they don't treat you well in return. Mr. Blackwell had handled the situation with grace and dignity, and it was a lesson I wouldn't soon forget. As the plane touched down and we taxied toward the gate, I couldn't stop reflecting on the events that had unfolded in the last few hours. What had seemed like a routine flight had turned into something far more impactful, something that would stick with me long after the journey ended. In a world where status, appearances, and wealth often define how people are treated, Mr. Blackwell's calm demeanor and quiet authority had shown us all the true measure of power. It wasn't in the wealth he accumulated or the high-ranking position he held. No, the real power lay in his ability to remain composed, dignified, and respectful, even when faced with disrespect and judgment. It was a stark reminder of how fragile our assumptions about others can be. People often judge others based on how they look or the way they are perceived, but Mr. Blackwell, despite being treated unfairly, didn't lash out or make anyone feel small. Instead, he showed grace under pressure, opting to handle the situation with respect, knowing that those who truly have influence don't need to shout or belittle others to get their point across. The way he treated Emily with calm authority, never demeaning her, but holding her accountable for her actions, was a lesson in leadership that many people overlook. True leaders build others up rather than breaking them down, and Mr. Blackwell had demonstrated that principle effortlessly. What struck me most, however, was the ripple effect that moment had on the people around us. While many passengers had initially ignored the tension, I could see the realization dawning on them. Here was a man who wasn't defined by what others thought of him, but by his actions and integrity. As the flight ended and passengers began to disembark, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. People who had witnessed the exchange looked at each other with newfound respect, as if they too had learned something important. They saw firsthand what it meant to treat others with dignity, regardless of their background or status. As for Emily, her expression of remorse and her eventual apology were telling. She was clearly ashamed of how she had acted, but it was Mr. Blackwell's willingness to hold her accountable that allowed her the chance to learn and grow. Perhaps the real power was in giving others the opportunity to make things right. In the end, Mr. Blackwell's simple yet profound lesson stayed with me. Respect is not a privilege earned through wealth or title, but a fundamental right that everyone deserves. And how we treat others, especially those who might not be able to fight back, is a reflection of our own character. That lesson, more than anything else, was the most valuable part of that flight.